So, Fiorella, I believe you're a writer.
I am, yes. I've been a writer.
What do you write?
I write historical fiction and also, more recently, crime fiction.
What sort of historical fiction? What periods?
I vary quite a lot. I rather homed in on the mid-20th century because my crime fiction is set just after the Second World War. But I've written a book about the First World War, about the early days of the Second World War, and also about the slave trade, so going right back into the 1600s. So I like to be able to go on lots of different journeys into the past. You know, it's like being a time traveller.
Yeah, doesn't sound like a bundle of laughs, so...
The book about the slave trade was definitely the darkest book I've ever written.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't like to write anything like it again, but I come from slave ancestry, and Malta has a history of slavery, North African slavery, and I've always wanted to write a book about my people's experience of the slave trade. So that was always something I wanted to do, but it's very much a once in a career thing. You know, you take that journey into the past just the once, because it is very dark, it's very depressing.
Yeah. What's the initial attraction to subject matter? I mean, is it a story, is it a character, is it a period of history?
It varies a lot, actually. With the slave trade, I wanted to write a book about the Mediterranean slave trade, so I started off with a period and then thought of the characters, and the more research I did, the more the setting started to come to life. And in fact, the story I ended up writing was very, very different to what I initially envisaged.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to have more humane characters than I realised I could. When I actually did the research and realised what happened, I had to make the story a lot darker.
Yeah.
So in some cases, yes, it's a period. In other cases, it's just an idea. So with one of my books, with Father William's daughter, it's all about a priest who inherits a child.
Right.
His brother is killed in a car crash, and his brother is a widower, and he has to look after this child. And it all stemmed from the fact that when I was a child, my parents had written a will, like all responsible parents do, and they'd named my uncle as my legal guardian, who was in fact a priest.
Oh, right.
And I remember saying, well, what would actually have happened?
Yes.
You know, would I have gone and lived in his monastery or in his parish or whatever? And so the story, in fact, it's a tragicomic story about what happens, and it develops all sorts of ideas about sort of unexpected parenthood and all sorts of things like that. But that literally came from a what-if situation.
But answer me this, because historical fiction is very broad and there's wonderful scope. But what is the difference from a Catholic perspective, as a Catholic writer, entering into that world? Is there a difference?
I think there is, because I'd like to hope that a Catholic writer would approach the past with a little more humility than
Is that your
modern
strongest
writers do.
point, humility, would you say?
Humility, yes, I'm very humble. Yes, I've written books about my humility. But seriously, I think, because we have this traditions and our sense of our place in history, I would like to think that helps us to perhaps be a little bit more humble about where we stand in the great story of humanity. So perhaps when we look back into the past, we don't do so with the idea of, gosh, we're so progressive, we're so modern, and weren't they stupid? Hopefully we would have a slightly more broad-minded attitude.
It's really kind of interesting, because you use the word, the complaint about Catholicism is not progressive enough, and yet we are very much a historical religion, right?
We are, exactly.
So does that play out in the fiction, that it's more progressive in a sense, being a Catholic historical fiction novelist?
I'd say it's more open-minded. It's entirely connected up with perspective, and perspective is so important when you're writing about the past. There's that old line from The Go-Between, the past is a foreign country, and I quote it extensively in my book, We'll Never Tell Them. The narrator keeps coming back to that line, and you have a choice as a writer of historical fiction in terms of how you travel to that foreign country. Are you going to be the annoying tourist who expects all the food that you're used to and doesn't want to interact with the locals? Or are you going to be someone who goes on an adventure and really seeks to get to know that country? And that is, I hope, what a Catholic writer can do.
Yeah. What's the role then of the Catholic novelist in rebuilding culture?
It's to recast the narrative.
Right.
Yeah. You recast narrative.
So you don't propagandize.
No.
You don't preach.
Nope.
That's for the pulpit.
Absolutely. If you want to be a lecturer, be a lecturer.
Right.
Or if you want to write a textbook, write a textbook.
Right.
So it's recasting the narrative, and that's the wonderful thing about historical fiction, because so much of the way history is treated and mistreated it's all about making us feel good about ourselves.
What do you mean?
Well, it's about saying, look, this is where we are here. Aren't we progressive? We're so woke. We're so enlightened. Aren't we wonderful? And so therefore, how did we get here? Well, we got here because the past was awful and history was terrible, and there was this wonderful journey to enlightenment. In fact, I think the Age of Enlightenment is very responsible for this idea of this constant move towards positive change. And what the Catholic writer should be doing is saying, just a moment, are you sure about that? Are you sure we really are more moral, we have better values than we had in the past? And to actually go back into the past and try to understand a little bit better how people really did live their lives, but to do it respectfully.
Okay, but can a historical fiction writer, 21st century, young woman like yourself, born shortly before this century, can you really write with the insight for somebody in the Second World War, First World War, 17th century?
It's a valid question, and I think, in all honesty, you can never completely get rid of those lenses that you know, of the focus of the modern world, because we grew up in this time.
Yes.
And in the end, however much research you do, you can't really say what it was like living in 1850s London, or you know, in the trenches in the First World War. There's always going to be some gap,
that's right,
if you like, of imagination. But I do think if you really immerse yourself in the period, which is what I do when I'm writing a book.
Right.
So, for example, when I wrote about the First World War, I listened to First World War music, I read newspapers from the time, you know, newspaper articles from the time.
Is it true that you dressed for that period completely in First World War outfits?
I didn't, but I learned a lot about the fashions of the times.
Right.
You know, I could tell you exactly what a woman was wearing in 1940.
Really?
Yeah, it's important.
Really? You really go into that much?
Oh, in that much detail. But also, this is where understanding the people comes into it. One of the reasons why a certain scriptwriter, I shall not mention, got into trouble with his period drama was that he was using expressions that had only just been coined in 1920.
Fatal mistake.
Yeah, when someone in his 50s in a rural area would never have heard of that expression.
Yes.
So it's also a question of understanding the people you're writing about. So, for example, in my First World War book, there's an older doctor who's a bit conservative. So I wasn't going to dress him up in the style of 1930 when he would in fact probably have been dressing more like the style of 1918.
Yes.
It's things like that make a difference. But it's mostly just trying to strip away your own expectations.
But is there a sense, Fiorella, where you know the idea that, which I'm not absolutely sold on, that all novels are autobiographical? But is there also an idea that all novels are really about now?
If you look at any book written about the past, whenever it was, if you look at Ivanhoe, it tells you a lot more about the period in which it was written than about the period it was trying to write about.
England,
yeah, fair enough. And I think that is unavoidable, and we have to sort of accept that as part of the package when you're writing historical fiction. It is historical fiction, it's not a historical document from the period. But I do think that if you go humbly on that journey, you can get as close as it's possible to get to that time. You have to really care about the characters. You have to respect them. The biggest problem, I think, with so many writers of historical fiction now is they do patronise the past. They go by the assumption, before they've even started their research, that the people they're writing about were idiots. You know, they're already looking down on them.
Yeah.
Or like they were a bit like children who hadn't developed enough yet. If you go into the past and really embrace it and say, these were my brothers from another time.
Yeah.
And you can start to try to reconstruct the sort of values they would have held.
Okay, I get that. But is there a sense where you and I are living now?
Yeah.
This historical moment, this epoch, is ours.
Yes.
And is there a case that our fiction or creative energy should be exploring, interrogating this moment in time, rather than looking back to other times, exploring other crises, other dilemmas, other contradictions that people dealt with 100 years ago, 200 years ago?
Well, I don't think there's any reason why you can't do so by going back into the past, because, as I've already suggested, in order to understand the world we currently live in, we have to understand how we got here, but we have to have an honest view of how we got here. One of the problems I always feel with the way history is taught in British schools is that children are taught, say, the Second World War or the First World War. They're not taught about the unification of Germany or Italy, or any of the big upheavals in Europe in the 19th century that created that world. You can't understand it unless you understand what came before. And I do think that a very important way of perhaps challenging the way we see ourselves is to understand how we got here and understand how people really did live in the past, not the strange caricature we've created.
So, Fiorella, what you're talking to me about is some kind of understanding of Catholic salvation history.
Yeah.
That history is a stream, and that you are plugging into a stream which is not a series of isolated events, but something which is continuous, has a beginning, which was the Garden of Eden, has a middle, which is Golgotha, and has an end, which is the second coming.
That's exactly what I mean. Exactly. It's that tapping into, as you say, the stream, rather than seeing history as if it were a series of isolated events that are completely separate from one another and that do not draw on one another. So it's mostly really a question of imagination. I don't think it's even difficult. It's a question of imagination and friendship with the past, a sense of fellowship with the past, if you like.
I think that's really interesting. Talk to me a bit about the Catholic imagination. What's the difference between the Catholic imagination and, say, the secular imagination which passes for so much literature today?
Well, I think that the secular imagination is quite narcissistic. If you imagine someone looking in a mirror, as opposed to looking out of a window, maybe that's the image I would use.
Really?
Yes. That the Catholic imagination is about looking out, not looking in so much.
So are you rejecting the whole sort of Freudian construct?
Well, the Freudian construct has been mostly rejected, let's face it, apart from in my English faculty, as far as I can work out. It's the only place where they taught Freud seriously.
But also sort of modernism in literature, it's all about stream of consciousness, it's all about internal debates, it's all, you're saying that is just narcissism?
I'm not saying there's no room at all for any kind of internal conversation, because so much of our spirituality involves an internal conversation, at least a private conversation. It's also connected up with our understanding that we are more than the sum of our parts. We are more than our minds and our bodies. We have a soul. We're on a journey. It's a very different way, really, of seeing human life and the human journey, and it's become radical. This is the way most people saw the world once, but it's become less usual, and I think certainly contemporary fiction is very aggressively secular, but there are trends that are going the other way. There are also books that I think are maybe trying to capture some sense of the spiritual journey or the spiritual life, but it's very much at the moment on the fringes. But it just comes back in the end to the imagination, to that sense of fellowship with the past. That the past is a foreign country, but the people of the past are not foreigners. Okay,
so is the past a foreign country?
Yes. The world changes, and people do things differently.
But human nature doesn't change.
But human nature doesn't change. That's what I mean. That you have, in the past, the traditions may have been different, the way people saw the world might have been different, the social mores may have been different, but human nature does not really change fundamentally.
So taking the analogy of the stream flowing through history, are we saying the stream is human nature, it never changes, it just keeps flowing through, but the pastures either side of that stream are different?
Yeah, you should write a novel.
With you, maybe?
Yes.
Now, we're in a wood. Do you know who was in a wood? Who got lost in a wood?
Dante.
Correct.
Nel mezzo di cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai nella selva oscura.
Which means?
In the middle of the journey of my life, I found myself in a wood where the way was lost.
But I think tonight we haven't lost our way, have we? Because the way is, as the good book says, the way, the truth and the life.
Absolutely.
And that's true for Catholic novelists.
Absolutely.
Even true for you.
I would hope so.
Let's walk.